On the morning of August the 15th, following the continued refusal of the Yazidis to convert, ISIL fighters descended. Over the course of our investigation, UNITAD has collected extensive testimonial accounts from survivors. Our forensics team has used a range of technologies to document the environment of Kojo village. Here, you see locations of laser scan capture points that were ultimately converted into a high-resolution 3D model. And through the collection of call data records, we can track the call activity in and out of the village. By synthesizing these assets, UNITAD has pieced together the tragic events of August the 15th, beginning at Kojo School, where ISIL had demanded that all the villagers should report.
When I got to the school, it was already almost full, because most people lived closer than I did.
The school was crowded with hundreds of frightened villagers.
This hallway was full of people.
Some Daesh members came to us and told us to hand over all our belongings, our gold, money, and phones.
According to call data records obtained by UNITAD, phone activity essentially ends as ISIL confiscates the villagers' means of communication. Once in the school, ISIL separated the men from the women.
The women were put upstairs and there were Daesh fighters at the bottom of each set of stairs.
Sheikh Ahmed Jasso, the Mukhtar of the village, was being held in the main hall of the school. The women who were being held upstairs could hear the activity through the balcony above.
I heard the Daesh member say to Ahmed Jasso, "If all of you convert to Islam, we will not order you to do anything." Ahmed Jasso said, "If I speak for myself, I will not become Muslim. But let me ask my people." Then all the men said, "We will not become Muslim."
Downstairs, ISIL began to remove the men from the school in small groups. The men were taken in groups to a number of sites around Kojo. Many believed they were being transported to safety, to Mount Sinjar.
When we first got in the truck, we thought we were going towards Sinjar mountain. But when it turned towards here, we started to get scared.
Unknown to them, the men were being collected for mass execution at a number of sites surrounding Kojo village.
Daesh told us to get out of the vehicle and organize ourselves in a single line. We couldn't arrange ourselves in a line as we were panicking and scared, so we held each other's hands. At that moment, all I thought of was my son, because I thought to myself that Daesh would kill our children too. Daesh surrounded us in a circle and were holding PKCs, pistols, and AK-47s. In a few minutes, they started shooting at us, and we all fell to the ground.
There's the grave. They were shooting from behind until we were all collected there. They lined up and they told us to crouch down like this. That's when they shot us and the planes were flying overhead, and after they stopped shooting, they started killing people over there too.
On August the 15th, hundreds of men, nearly the entire male population of Kojo, was systematically and deliberately murdered. There are 17 mass grave sites in and around Kojo. UNITAD has worked with local authorities and the Yazidi community to identify and excavate all of them. With advanced technology and in close partnership with Iraqi and KRG authorities, UNITAD has ensured that the evidence collected is in line with international standards and incorporated into case files assembled against those responsible. For the women and children of Kojo, the horrors of August the 15th were merely the beginning. ISIL transported everyone left at Kojo school north to the nearby small village of Sola, at the site of a former technical college that ISIL used as a holding area.
Daesh took us to the Solah Institute. It was around 2 p.m. and we stayed there overnight. On the second day, about 10 o'clock, the Daesh members took the old women outside of the institute.
My mother saw an excavator outside and that Daesh fighters were preparing for the execution.
UNITAD has confirmed that 82 women, 40 years old or older, and 10 boys were executed in this mass grave next to the Solar Institute, which was finally excavated in November 2020 and their remains collected.
After that, they took us, the younger women and children, to a school in Tel Afar.
From Tel Afar, women and children entered an extensive network of human trafficking. Almost without exception, the women ended up in sexual slavery. UNITAD's diverse collection of evidence has enabled the team to identify key perpetrators of the Kojo massacre and subsequent trafficking of women and children. An ISIL payroll roster extracted from battlefield evidence revealed detailed information such as full names and monthly salaries for a number of suspects. One of the principal perpetrators of the Kojo massacre, a man known as Abu Hamza, appears repeatedly. As part of this effort, the team partnered Situ Research to develop a digital evidence presentation platform which will be made available to national authorities. The platform translates the meticulous details of the case brief into a dynamic and accessible repository of evidence that can be presented clearly in court. Through close cooperation with the families of victims, Iraqi authorities and NGOs, UNITAD has also recently supported the identification and return of remains of some of those killed in Kojo on the 15th of August, 2014. This represented a profound moment of reflection for the Yazidi community and a small step towards justice for the victims and the survivors of the Kojo massacre. UNITAD is continuing its work with Iraqi authorities in order to identify remains and support their return to their families for proper and dignified burial. The massacres and subsequent enslavement of the Yazidi population of Kojo represents one of the many egregious and brutal examples of violence inflicted by ISIL on the Iraqi people. But it is important to note that such crimes were not limited to the Yazidi community or just the Sinjar region. The crimes of ISIL have impacted all communities in Iraq, whether Shia, Sunni, Christian, Kakai or Shabak. The investigative priorities of UNITAD will continue to reflect the calls for justice from all of these communities. In doing so, we seek to meet the demands of survivors and the families of victims for individual perpetrators to be held accountable in a court of law, thereby building a basis for lasting peace and reconciliation.
Now, colleagues, it is my great honour to welcome back to the United Nations the 2018 co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict, Ms. Nadia Murad.
Ambassadors, representatives, Special Advisor Karim Khan, my dear friend Amal Clooney, good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking the co-hosts of today's event. I'm also grateful to the members of the Security Council for making UNITAD's work possible. Special thanks to my friend Karim Khan for tirelessly leading UNITAD's innovative documentation efforts. It has been an honor working with you, and I wish you the best in your new role. If you had told me when the Security Council was debating UNITAD's creation that I would be able to bury my brothers within 4 years, I would not have believed you. I did not think that their remains would be identified or that I would be able to say goodbye and finally lay them to rest. It was too painful to hope when my community had been ignored for so long. Yet, this past February, thanks to multilateral action from member states and the ongoing work of UNITAD, me and many survivors were able to honor loved ones lost during the Kojo massacre. Yazidi families wish to return home to Sinjar, but living among mass graves is unthinkable. Those who were able to bury relatives in Kojo have gained a piece of closure that is needed to restart our lives. The burial ceremony was a small taste of what comprehensive justice could mean for my community's healing. It solidified my understanding that accountability is not an abstract legal principle, but something that tangibly affects our everyday life. As I recently told Karim, those of us who were able to bury family members earlier this year are considered fortunate. Fortunate is difficult to comprehend when you realize that some families identified as many as 8 relatives in one mass grave. But the basic dignity of burying a loved one seems like a privilege when the majority of mass graves remain unexhumed. There are thousands of survivors with relatives missing in ISIS captivity or unmarked graves. For many, loss is magnified by uncertainty. I lost my mother and 6 of my brothers. I was ripped from my homeland, separated from my sisters and nieces, and sold into sexual slavery alongside too many Yazidi women and children. I may never know what happened to my sisters-in-law or schoolmates, but the horrors I survived pale in comparison to the pain of watching my community continue to suffer. 7 years have passed. For 7 years, more than half of my community has languished in internally displaced camps, waiting to return home. For 7 years, almost 3,000 women and children have waited to be rescued from captivity and reunited with their families. For 7 long years, hundreds of thousands of Yazidi genocide survivors have awaited justice and accountability for the horrific crimes they endured. I am fearful, not of ISIS. I am fearful that survivors will never receive justice. I worry that mass graves will become landmarks in Sinjar, and victims will never receive dignified burials. I am terrified that the world will forget what was done by ISIS, and perpetrators will be free to continue inflicting sexual violence and ethnic cleansing on women and girls like me. The possibility of repeated persecution is not hypothetical. Yazidis in Iraq were subjected to decades of discrimination and multiple genocides. I cannot help but wonder if accountability for these crimes would have prevented ISIS from repeating history. The truth is that the evidence collected by UNITAD does not only paint a picture of what happened to Yazidis in 2014. It provides a forecast of what Yazidis, minorities, and women will suffer in the future if you do not act. When we fail to hold terrorist groups accountable for genocide and sexual violence, we invite future groups to commit the same horrendous crimes. This is a dangerous precedent to set. The United Nations was established to hold parties accountable for genocide and to prevent atrocities. Because of that promise, survivors have put themselves at a great personal risk to share their experiences of sexual violence. They have defied taboos and faced stigma in the hopes that you would hold their abusers accountable. As member states, you have a responsibility to pursue justice for the sake of Yazidis and your own founding principles. Yazidis cannot restart their lives without stable security and governance in Sinjar. We cannot restore our homeland without international support. We cannot begin to heal without trials in national and international courts. We are thankful to all member states who have supported evidence collection and justice for Yazidis and minorities in Iraq. Now member states have the opportunity to lead the decisive next steps in the path to justice, not only for Yazidis, but for all religious minorities that suffered from ISIS's terrorism, including Christians, Shabak, Kakai, and victims of Speicher massacre. With clear evidence that ISIS's crimes constitute genocide, it is imperative that justice no longer be delayed. I stand before you today to ask you to establish formal legal proceedings, send the Yazidi case to ICC, or create a court by treaty. I also welcome the efforts that the legislators in Baghdad and Erbil are undertaking to create ISIS courts that comply with international standards. The Yazidi community's faith in the justice process would be greatly strengthened by the involvement of international judges and monitoring by the international community. For true justice and reconciliation, survivors must see that due process is upheld in Iraqi courts to count of genocide and sexual violence, not only terrorism, and that survivors are included in this process every step of the way. Evidence reveals that ISIS carefully planned the Yazidi genocide. The international response should be no less thorough. Without accountability, Yazidis are stuck in a cycle of suffering, genocide, sexual violence, impunity, repeat. You all have the power to break this cycle. Thank you so much.